They shaved off every strand of hair, even her pubic hair. Deprived of the comfort she once had in pulling and eating hair, her hunger and obsession took an even darker form. She began cutting herself, finding some solace in the taste of her own blood, which seemed to quiet the terrible, unexplainable hunger gnawing at her from within. From a young age, Damilola was known for her brilliance. She excelled in school and her teachers predicted a bright future ahead. But she had a habit that started as innocent nervousness and soon grew into something far darker. Damilola was addicted to pulling and eating her own hair. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Fisayo, were beside themselves with worry. At first, they thought it was just a passing phase, something she would eventually grow out of. But as Damilola's obsession grew, so did the clumps of hair missing from her once beautiful thick hair. The floor of her room was often strewn with strands and her fingers never seemed to leave her scalp. Before this obsession became uncontrollable, Damilola was a star in her class. She was naturally gifted and her teachers admired her sharp mind and quick grasp of concepts. She was friendly, engaging with her classmates, participating actively in discussions, and even helping others with difficult subjects. Her classmates looked up to her and her teachers frequently used her as an example of what a dedicated student should be. As this obsession intensified, Dami grew distant, her eyes often vacant as she stared at her desk, her fingers subconsciously moving to her hair, pulling strands and chewing on them when she thought no one was watching. Her classmates would report her to the teacher, who in turn would caution her, thinking it was just a nasty habit. Damilola became more withdrawn, isolated in a self-imposed bubble, sitting in the back of the room and rarely speaking. Her responses to questions became short, almost robotic. She seemed trapped in her own world, barely present, lost in a haze of her compulsions. Her class teacher, Mrs. Adetola, reported the issue to the principal. "This is more than just a phase, sir," Mrs. Adetola said, her voice low. "I've tried to speak to her, but she barely responds. And now, the other children, they are frightened of her. I think our parents need to know how serious this has become." The principal nodded slowly, understanding the urgency. He picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Fisayo's number, hoping they would be able to come in as soon as possible. The call was brief, and within hours, Damilola's parents arrived, visibly anxious as they sat across from Mr. Adekunle in his office. "Thank you for coming on such short notice," he began, clasping his hands together on the desk. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to talk to you about Damilola. She's been showing some concerning behaviors in school." Mr. Remy leaned forward, his face tense. "What kind of behavior, sir?" Mrs. Adetola spoke up, explaining what she had witnessed over the past few months. She detailed Damilola's hair pulling and the increasing isolation. As she spoke, Mrs. Remy's eyes filled with tears, her hand clutching her husband's arm tightly. "I know this is difficult to hear," Mr. Adekunle said, his voice gentle but firm. "Damilola is a brilliant student, but it is clear she is struggling with something far beyond what we can handle here in school. I think it may be best if you consider seeking professional help." Mrs. Remy's voice trembled as she spoke. We knew she had a habit of pulling her hair, but we didn't realize it had gotten this bad. She's our only child. We've tried everything we could at home." The principal offered a reassuring nod. This isn't easy for any parent, but please know we are here to support her in any way we can. If you need a recommendation for counseling or additional resources, we're more than willing to assist. Our goal is to help Damilola return to the happy, thriving girl she once was. Mr. Remy nodded solemnly, though he seemed lost in thought, grappling with the realization of how severe Damilola's condition had become. We will do whatever it takes, he said quietly. We will get her all the help she needs. Mr. and Mrs. Fisayo sought help, bringing her to the best psychologists and doctors they could find. Doctors diagnosed the condition as trichopegia and proceeded with treatment. But every solution, every medication, every therapy, even counseling, only seemed to scratch the surface. Her obsession ran deep and it continued to consume her. They took a drastic measure, shaving her head entirely, thinking that without hair she would have nothing to pull. But Damilola's desperation took a terrifying turn. She began reaching for the hair of others. Her classmates, strangers, even family members would find themselves targets of her insatiable need. She would pull hair from any head she could reach, and the consequences of her actions began to isolate her. Her friends drifted away, no one wanted to come near her, and the principal had to stop her from coming to school. Her parents locked her up in an empty room after she became a danger to herself and others. They shaved off every strand of hair, even her pubic hair, in an attempt to strip her of the source of her strange addiction, but even that did not stop her. Every day, her mother would bring meals to her, pleading softly as she held a spoon of food to Damilola's lips. Her mother's voice would break as she whispered, "Just a little, Dami. Please, for me." Each time, Damilola would shake her head, her face twisted in frustration. Sometimes she would let a few bites in, only to spit them out, the food dribbling down her chin as she refused to swallow. Her once vibrant body had become a shadow. Her cheeks, once full, were now sunken, and her arms and legs were frail, the bones pressing visibly against her thinning skin. She had lost so much weight that her clothes hung loosely, and her energy seemed to drain with each passing day. It tore at her mother's heart to see her only child, her daughter, waste away, rejecting every meal. Despite her best efforts, despite spoon-feeding her, trying to coerce or even gently force a few bites into her mouth, nothing seemed to quell Damilola's hunger for what was forbidden. She would clutch at her mother's arm, her fingers scratching as if reaching for hair, her eyes dark with a desperation her mother could neither understand nor soothe. Deprived of the comfort she once had in pulling and eating hair, her hunger and obsession took an even darker form. She began cutting herself, finding some solace in the taste of her own blood, which seemed to quiet the terrible, unexplainable hunger gnawing at her from within. One night, her mother found her huddled in the corner, blood trickling from fresh wounds she had made on her arms. The sight nearly broke Remy. Her hands trembled as she pressed the cloth to her daughter's wounds and prayed under her breath. She didn't know what to do, but she knew she couldn't let her only child continue down this path of self-destruction. In desperate attempt, her parents put her in chains. They wrapped her arms and legs in padded shackles, securing her to a bed frame. It was the only way they knew to keep her from hurting herself further. Damilola trashed and screamed the first few nights, her cries echoing through the silent house, piercing the hearts of her parents, who stood helpless outside the door. They had never imagined doing this to their only daughter, but they were running out of options. After a few days of being in chains, Dami started to bite on her shoulders, being the only part of her body she could reach with her teeth. When her parents noticed this, they wrapped her shoulders with thick clothing to prevent that. She would scream and move her head violently from side to side, clenching, grinding, and gnashing her teeth. In those moments, Mrs. Remy would weep silently, stroking her daughter's shaved hair, praying that something would break this terrible curse. It felt like watching her child slip further away, and every refused meal deepened the despair in her heart. Damilola was becoming a stranger, consumed by an affliction that defied all reason. Her body and mind held hostage by a craving no one understood. One night, after another failed attempt to feed her, Mrs. Remy fell to her knees outside the door of that small isolated room, clutching her hands together as tears ran down her face. She prayed with a fervor that could only come from the depths of a mother's despair. Her voice roared as she begged for a miracle. Her pleas echoed in the silence of the house, a cry that seemed to rise into the heavens, carrying the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, would hear. As the weeks turned into months, Damilola's condition worsened. Her once brilliant mind became clouded, her spirit restless. She barely spoke, her gaze vacant. Her parents watched helplessly as their daughter, their only child, faded away. They had tried every treatment they knew, but nothing seemed to work. All hope seemed lost. Her father, Mr. Tayo, did not believe in prayers or miracles and has refused any suggestions of church or prayers. Remy, on the other hand, was desperate for any help she could find. One fateful day, Mrs. Remy met a woman in the local market. The woman had a calm, knowing smile and seemed to carry an aura of kindness. In a casual conversation, Mrs. Remy shared her struggles, speaking of the heartache and despair she felt watching her daughter suffer. The woman listened carefully and then gave her a gentle suggestion. "There's a prayer channel I know," the woman said softly. "The pastor there is known to pray for cases no one else can solve. It may sound strange, but perhaps this could be what Damilola needs." Though skeptical, Mrs. Remy felt she had nothing to lose. That night, she tuned into the prayer channel, listening to the pastor's voice as she prayed fervently. She followed along, whispering the words with all her heart, asking for a miracle. Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Remy continued praying. She prayed every morning and every night, sometimes in tears, her heart aching for her daughter's freedom. She joined the prayer sections, even fasting at times, desperate for a breakthrough. One evening, as she was watching the program, the pastor gave a word of knowledge describing a girl suffering from a peculiar condition, an addiction to eating her own hair and cutting herself to taste her blood. Mrs. Remy's heart skipped a beat. The pastor went on, praying specifically for the girl's deliverance, declaring freedom over her life. Almost immediately, something shifted in Damilola's spirit. She felt a warmth wash over her, a peace she hadn't known in years. Slowly, her fingers released their grip, and for the first time, her mind felt clear. She looked at her mother, who had rushed into her room with tears in her eyes. Damilola didn't understand fully what had happened, but for the first time in a very long time, she could remember. She didn't feel the urge to pull or eat her hair. The following weeks were transformative. Damilola regained her strength and focus. Her parents watched in awe as their daughter blossomed again. Her laughter returning, her brilliant mind reawakening. She went back to school, resumed her studies, and eventually her friends returned. In time, Damilola's story became a testimony, one her family shared to everyone who cared to listen. Her healing brought salvation to her family, and her parents and even Damilola repented and gave their lives to Christ. Dear listener, I don't know what you're struggling with today, but have it at the back of your mind that there is nothing prayers cannot do. Wherefore God had highly exalted him and given him a name that is above every name, that at the mention of Jesus every knee will bow and every tongue will confess.